I had driven 3 hours through a late spring rain because my son's wife had gone into labor. I had a casserole in the passenger seat and a promise in my pocket. I would hold my grandson the moment he came into the world. I had been a medical billing administrator for 35 years. I knew hospital routines almost by muscle memory. I knew how to read a chart and what questions to ask. I thought that knowledge made me useful that day. I never thought it would make me a victim. If this story matters to you, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. So many of you have shared similar stories, and we need to know we're not alone. "I shouldn't even be out here," David shouted at me from the threshold as I stood in the family lounge, the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the antiseptic scent rubbing at the back of my throat. His voice was low but sharp, the way it sounds when more is hurt than anger. "Mom, you have to leave. Jessica asked for privacy." The door clicked behind him, the way it does when someone shuts out more than a person. For a moment, I stood stunned, casserole cooling at my feet, my hands empty of the thing I'd come to give. Then a nurse in scrubs with a badge and a polite smile walked up and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we have to ask you to step outside." I remember the feel of the corridor floor under my soles, the tinny sound of the vending machine through the wall, and a small metal sign on the door that read, "Visiting hours. Please respect privacy." I remember thinking there had been a mistake. I remember thinking David would come back for me, that Jessica would laugh and we'd all eat warm casserole and I would hold Nathan before anyone else. I remember how that promise dissolved. They told me later, in different words and with different faces, that there were forms. That is the part that has haunted me and then later sustained me. The forms. The hospital had records that named me as the guarantor on a maternity admission filed under a name I did not recognize. The signature looked like mine enough for someone to mistake it for first glance. The administrative clerk who pulled them for me said, "We thought maybe you had mailed them in ahead of time." That was the only kindness I got that night. "Do you know this person?" Detective Richardson asked me the next morning in a small interview room whose walls smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The table was scarred where so many pens had tapped nervous rhythms. I told him what I knew, my handwriting, the loops in my letters, the way I cross my T's high. He nodded like an investigator should and slid a photocopy across the table. The photocopy was stamped November 15th, 11:47 p.m. The form bore my name as guarantor, a phone number that was not mine, and an address I hadn't lived at since 1999. The signature had the same slope as mine. It had the wrong middle initial. The hospital timestamp said the admission was processed at 11:47 p.m., the same time my car was still on the highway, 2 hours from the city, because the rain had slowed me down and David had texted, "Take your time, Mom, Jessica's resting." I showed him pictures from the dashboard camera app on my phone. The image metadata showed my car out past mile marker 62 at 11:50 p.m. Detective Richardson leaned forward, the light catching his forehead. "That timestamp could be the key," he said. "If we can prove you were miles away at that time, it's not just a forged signature, it's identity theft." A week earlier, I had tucked into bed and dreamed of newborn breaths. A week later, my son had shut a door in my face, and the police had my signature on a page that said I had agreed to pay a bill for someone I had never met. That is how betrayal tastes, flat and metallic. I need to say this plainly. I loved Jessica when she first walked into our lives. She was sweet with a quick laugh and the kind of nervous energy that made everything feel new. I was naive in many ways, but not about red flags. I told myself I could trust David's judgment. He raised his eyebrows the way he always did when I worried. He said, "She's different. It's fine, Mom." I believed him until the night he said, "You have to go." After that night, I slept in my car in the church parking lot because I couldn't bear the idea of showing up at their house and being turned away again. I sat under a street lamp and made a list the way I always did when problems needed solving. Dates, contacts, copies of everything. When you work in billing, you learn to treat paperwork like a trail of breadcrumbs. You learn that small inconsistencies, an initial in the wrong place, a wrong number, are often the shape of a larger lie. The breadcrumb trail led me to a small folder in the hospital records office that Detective Richardson had secured. He let me sift through it because he knew I'd know where to look. The first thing I found was a registration form, then a copy of a driver's license posted as proof of identity. The license photo looked like a stranger, the name on it an alias. The registration bore a hospital account number linked to a billing ledger that had charges routed through a third-party financial services vendor. My training made the pattern jump out. An alternate billing contact, different mailing addresses for statements, claims submitted across state lines. "There's a pattern here," I told the detective. "Look at the guarantor addresses. They don't line up with the patient's address. They're rerouting statements. Someone's taking advantage of the system." We began to find other small things that did not fit. A hotel receipt from 3 months earlier with a room billed to a name I recognized from a police blotter. Jessica's maiden name, Jennifer Webb, except the receipt had a city in Oregon on it, and the person who stayed had used a phone number registered to a prepaid SIM. A photocopy of a social services intake with the same forged signature. A string of hospital bills that had been denied collection when the actual named patient disputed them. Each item was a stitch in a fabric that looked ugly under light. Detective Richardson called in Agent Lisa Chen from the Federal Compliance Unit after he pulled more files and found the same patterns across 3 hospitals in 2 states. When Agent Chen came to see me, she wore a navy suit and an expression that did not try to pretend she was not already tired. "We've seen this before," she said, sitting across from me with a legal pad. "Not exactly your pattern, but similar. We need you to keep everything. Texts, emails, receipts, anything you have. Don't delete anything. Do you have access to the photos on your phone?" I handed mine over because a crucial part of the work was trust. Agent Chen showed me a ledger on her tablet and pointed out the flags. Multiple admissions with the same billing contact but different patient names. Payments routed through an EIN not associated with any hospital. And, most disturbingly, an earlier arrest record for a Jennifer Webb in a county in Oregon and a connection to a Marcus Webb as an associate. "Marcus Webb," I said aloud, the name like a stone. David's brow had furrowed in a way I later realized was him recognizing his wife's history. "That's her ex-husband," he muttered when I told him. "He has a record." When investigators start to stitch together networks, they look for the connective tissue. Phone calls, IP addresses, transaction chains. They get warrants, subpoenas, and slowly the skeleton of a scheme appears. Agent Chen was careful with what she said to me, but her eyes told the story. This was not a one-off bad choice. This was organized. "We think this is a ring," she told me in her measured voice. "Not just Jessica in the hospital. Multiple victims, multiple states. Marcus is not just an ex. He has a pattern of coercive behavior." At home, that word, coercion, felt like a window cracking. David tried to defend her for a long time. He came over one night after I'd eaten the casserole cold and sat at my kitchen table and said, "Mom, people make mistakes. Maybe she needed help." He had that weary softness some men wear when they want to protect both their spouse and their mother. I said nothing at first because I was learning to measure what I said against proof. Later, I found a text thread on his phone, one he didn't think to hide well, that read, "Tell your mom I love her, but we can't let her come." And beneath it, in Jessica's voice, if the shorthand didn't lie, "She could ruin everything." I remember the first time I felt the floor drop, not because of a paper trail, but because of a specific, frightening sentence. Detective Richardson called me and said, "There's an allegation that this went beyond billing. We have reason to believe there was an attempt at extortion. We need to speak to you about what you were asked to do." He did not give me details then. He never gives details when he needs you to be honest without fear. "We think they used the hospital incident to create an opportunity," he said slowly. "For you, for someone else. We need your accounts. Do you have anyone who can testify to where you were on November 15th? The next stretch of time was a narrowing. Me cataloging my receipts, gathering photos of my car on the highway with timestamps, finding grocery receipts with dates, retrieving CCTV snapshots from the gas station where I had stopped that night. Agent Chen's team obtained surveillance stills from the hospital, and for the first time, I saw the person who had presented herself as Jessica at the admissions desk. The woman in the footage moved with a confidence that made my stomach turn. She carried a small bag and a warm smile, as if she belonged. The woman in the footage signed a paper. The woman in the footage was not me. A subpoena for cell phone records produced a string of calls between an unknown number and the prepaid phone listed on the hotel receipt in Oregon. Another chain of calls tied that prepaid to a number registered in Marcus Webb's name at the address where he'd been arrested years before. The web was forming. I want to pause here to say something about being older and underestimated. Being 65 did not mean I was slow or foolish. It meant I knew how to keep a ledger and how to cross-check a claim. When Agent Chen handed me copies of hospital forms that bore my name, I knew which flourishes were mine and which were not. I also knew the hospital's processes well enough to know that a forged guarantee was not merely paperwork. It could be used as leverage to demand payment, to threaten with collections, to bait someone into paying to avoid damage to their credit. It had an emotional effect, too, humiliation. I was publicly questioned, then subtly blamed, while the person who did the forging smiled behind their own closed doors. The day they arrested Jessica, it was raining again, almost as if weather could replay cruelty. I watched from the courthouse steps where family and a small swarm of reporters had gathered. David did not look at me. Nathan was in his father's arms. The officers moved with a choreography that felt rehearsed. Agents from multiple jurisdictions carried evidence boxes like relics. Jessica's expression changed several times as she was led past us. Systemically composed, then defiant, then, later, face down and small in an orange jumpsuit that made everything worse because it robbed her of personhood in the way uniforms do. Marcus was picked up in another state 2 days later as his car sat in a motel parking lot. The web was forming. That was not the end of it by any means. Arrests are a beginning in justice, not a finish line. When they put their hands on her and carried her away, I felt complicated things: vindication for the stolen reputation, grief for the family torn, and an ache that no judge can repair. David approached me then, and for the first time, his eyes were raw in a way that hid nothing. "I'm sorry," he said, which was small and enormous. He made no excuses for what he had done at the hospital. He said, "I was scared. I should have believed you sooner." The FBI wanted me to keep my mouth shut until subpoenas were served. The defense tried to pry at me with lawyers who were polite and pointed in different places. Michael Stevens, Jessica's attorney, called me once and said, "Miss Martinez, we understand you were hurt, but please remember, a trial is a search for truth, not vengeance." I heard his words through a filter. He was doing his job. Prosecutor Sarah Williams did not call me to comfort me. She called me to prepare me. "You will testify to pattern and business practices," she said. "We will need you to explain why those signatures don't match and why a timestamp matters. Stick to what you know." I had not planned on being a star witness, but the truth does not care for plans. In the weeks before the indictment, I met with Agent Chin and Detective Richardson in sterile offices. and with the prosecutor in a room perfumed by her own sense of purpose. We went through exhibits, the photocopies, the hotel receipts, bank deposits flagged for suspicious activity, the hospital billing logs with timestamps that contradicted the alleged guarantor's presence. There was a ledger of victims. There was a pattern across states. There was, tucked between pages, a note from an office assistant at one hospital. Patient listed guarantor could not be reached, claims routed to third party. That single sentence made my chest hot with a particular blend of rage and relief. It meant the system had recognized a problem and had left breadcrumbs. We followed them. Then the thing that made the difference emerged not from a single document, but from a witness who, by chance, had a different kind of memory. A night nurse in a hospital 2 states away remembered a man who had come by, asking odd questions about when a family might leave. And she remembered him because he had spilled his coffee on her shoes. Small things become crucial when stacked. She remembered a name, Marcus, after the investigators pushed with photos. Her memory, taken in the right way, became a thread and then a rope that tightened the case. Agent Chen told me once that criminal rings rely on the small invisibles, the hesitation at a receptionist's desk, the forgetting to check 2 pieces of ID, the assumption that an older person is not internet savvy. She said it with clinical clarity that masked a deeper human anger. They pick who they think will look the other way, she said. You were not that person. We put together an affidavit, and prosecutors drafted charges: identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, and, in the harshest reading, intent to interfere with custody through a plan that could have led to kidnapping. I will not go into procedural details. It is enough to say the indictment included more than billing irregularities. It included a series of communications and transactions that, when read together, painted a picture of a coordinated attempt to extract money and, worse, to manipulate family dynamics for leverage. Those words, coordinated and captured, are how investigators dress the moral weight of their work without turning it into melodrama. The arrest of Marcus Webb was the scariest day because he had a reputation that preceded him. I remember the agents briefing me in a van as thunder rolled over the city. They told me that Marcus had used threats in previous encounters and that he was considered dangerous. I sat with that. Danger, distance, and the knowledge that a hospital form had brought me face to face with threats that live in the spaces between people's vulnerabilities. The agents moved at dawn. News vans later ran footage of officers moving through motel corridors. I watched the grainy images on my kitchen television and held my hands together like a woman praying without calling it prayer. When arrests were made, the local paper wrote a headline that still makes my skin crawl: "Brutal family fraud shocks community." It overplayed a hand that was already raw. The court date was set for months ahead. There were motions and hearings and a long period of waiting that is its own kind of punishment. In that limbo, relationships reforged themselves slowly. David sat with me at my table one night and said, "I know I made it worse." We built a new pattern: daily calls, small meals, a returned casserole on occasion. He asked me how I was, and this time he listened to the answer. I kept doing the work I had always done. I documented. I sat with the prosecutor and reviewed exhibits until my eyes blurred. I learned how to keep my testimony crisp: dates, times, what I remembered, and how I knew it. I practiced the sound of my own voice saying the truth, because truth must be a muscle when it is under pressure. I did not become consumed by hate. I allowed my anger to be functional. Functionality is useful in court. There were moments that hurt in a way that no court could fix. At my grandson's christening, months later, David stood at the back, and I held Nathan in my arms, and he smelled like newness and possibility. I thought of how close we had come to losing him to a plan that never should have existed. I thought of Jessica and how many nights she must have terrified herself into a corner I could not reach. The law moved in ways that sometimes felt cold and insufficient, but it moved. The system, creaky and imperfect, did enough to stop them that time. Agents told me later, in a hearing in a room that smelled like old paper and litigation, that the plot, what they could prove, had been more dangerous than mere billing fraud. It wasn't just about money. Marcus had discussed plans that would create openings, distractions at hospitals, manufactured emergencies, and requests for meetings outside the glare of public places. Those conversations, when paired with the financial tracks, suggested the coordination needed to facilitate kidnapping. I am careful with my words, so I will say only that the prosecution argued these elements as part of a timeline, a pattern of creating opportunities by drawing family members into certain spaces at certain times while others took advantage elsewhere. The defense called it conjecture. A jury would listen and decide. Between the indictment and the preliminary hearing, few things changed materially in my daily life, but everything changed emotionally. I felt watched and then relieved when the government had enough to act. I felt alienated when people who had once smiled at me in church avoided my gaze because scandal is a contagion. I learned that justice is not only about punishment, it is about making sure the pieces fit together so the same pattern doesn't repeat elsewhere. I leaned into that, telling friends, neighbors, and anyone who would listen to check their statements, to be suspicious of strangers who demand your trust, to keep a ledger as if it were a map of your life. When agents presented the case to a grand jury, they did so with dry slides and a stack of exhibits that read like a bleak novel: hospital forms, receipts, chain of custody logs. I sat through that presentation and watched faces in the room change from skepticism to gravity. I realized then that my small act of keeping receipts had contributed to something larger. We were told to prepare for trial. There would be witness lists and expert testimony. The prosecution lined up a handwriting analyst and an expert in hospital billing practices. The defense prepared to poke holes. Michael Stevens' strategy, as I would later hear in court, was to paint me as mistaken or suggest my motivations were personal. It was a cruel calculus, turn the victim into a suspicion actor. I braced myself. In the month that followed, I had time to think about mercy and accountability without turning them into slogans. I thought about how easily trust can be weaponized and how family loyalty can blind one to obvious signs. I thought about the small ritual of holding a grandchild and how fiercely I would protect that moment for anyone who asked me to. The thing about being the kind of woman who can read a ledger is that you cannot unknow what you know. You either use it to protect or you let it sour into bitterness that eats your edges. I chose protection. Arrests had been made. Evidence had been collected. The state and federal prosecutors were coordinating. Marcus and Jessica were both in custody. The question that remained, what would come next, had the shape of a courtroom and the slow, grinding certainty of legal process. I found, in that waiting, an odd steadiness. I had been humiliated, and I had fought back with the tools I had. I had been kicked out on a night I should have been celebrated, and I had turned that hurt into a ledger that showed a pattern. I had become, unwillingly at first, a small bulwark against a larger, nasty thing. One night, Agent Chen came by my house with 2 files and a thermos of coffee. She sat on my porch and watched the sun dip behind the rows of maples, the light turning the street gold. "We might be able to show more than fraud," she said quietly. "We might be able to show intent to remove a child." Her voice was careful and not cruel. If the jury believes the pattern, the sentences could be severe, but we don't promise outcomes, we make our case. She leaned back, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The porch light flicked on over our heads, and the sound of a distant car went by. "Why did they pick me?" I asked, and it was both a practical question and a plaintive one. Because you're old, and because they thought you might be invisible, she said. Because they thought they'd get what they wanted, but you weren't invisible, you kept records. When she left, I sat on the porch for a long time, tracing the grain of the wooden armrest with the pad of my thumb. I thought of the hospital corridor and the clicking of the door. I thought about the baby whose first breath had been marked by someone else's lies. I had been pushed out of a hospital for the sake of a fake signature. I had pushed back. The mechanics of fear had met the mechanics of bureaucracy, and I had fought both with something as old and stubborn as paper. We were moving toward a trial date. The prosecution wanted witnesses ready. The defense wanted to delay. In the meantime, the family, fractured, began to re-knit. David spent more afternoons with me than he had in years. We cooked together in a way that felt like mending. He did not ask me to forgive him. He simply showed up and let time do that work. Nathan grew in his toddling and stubbornness, and the sight of him running into my arms one Sunday after church felt like a small, hard clearing in the mess. There is a kind of justice in the mundane. A casserole reheated, a small hand reached out, a seat at the table restored. But the center of the story remained the court calendar. Preparations continued, depositions, exhibits, the subtle ballet of subpoenas and protective orders. I readied myself for cross-examination by practicing short answers, by memorizing the chronology, by reminding myself not to volunteer speculation. There was comfort in a plain truth. There was comfort, too, in the company of the people who had stood with me, Agent Chen, Detective Richardson, Prosecutor Williams, whose steadiness turned a personal humiliation into a public reckoning. And yet, even as the legal wheels turned, I found myself thinking about the smaller things that protect us, keeping copies of letters, saving a receipt, asking one more question at a desk. It felt both petty and potent, that what saved me was what I could hold. My hands, those hardened working hands that had sorted bills and held babies and taught David how to tie his shoes, were a constant image for me. The same hands that would sign affidavits, that would tremble slightly under glare of courtroom lights, that would steady when the moment came to tell the truth. The indictment came down and the arraignment was scheduled. The defense filed motions. The prosecutors pushed forward with a stack of evidence that by then seemed to my friends like a mountain. We were not yet at the courtroom crescendo everyone wanted to see. There were still hearings, still argument, still the legal language that felt designed to occupy you without answering the moral question: why would someone choose to break a family? It took time to accept that justice is not instantaneous. It is a long stitch made of small, deliberate knots. I had thought at first that exposing the lie would be enough to heal the wound. It was not, but it was the beginning of a repair that had teeth. One clear morning, Agent Chen called and said, "They gave up a witness who can place Marcus at the motel the night the plan was discussed. Would you be willing to testify to what you found in the hospital records?" My voice would wobble, I knew, but I'd practiced. "Yes," I said. I did not yet know how the trial would feel, or whether the jury would see what I saw in the pile of photocopies and receipts. I only knew that I had been pushed out of a hospital on the day my grandson was born, and I had turned that humiliation into purpose. The rest, the courtroom, the verdict, the sentences, were the things that would either close the book or leave pages fluttering in the wind. As I walked into the prosecutor's office to review the next set of exhibits, the wall clock read 9:04 a.m. I put my hand on the file and steadied myself. The path ahead was long. There would be shouting in a courtroom. There would be arguments about interpretation. There would be the uncomfortable glare of public scrutiny. There would also be moments of relief, the feeling of being believed by investigators who took the time to follow the trail. I had been kicked out on my grandson's birth, and I would not let that night be the last word. I had a voice, I had a ledger, I had witnesses, and slowly, in meetings and subpoenas and small courtrooms, those things began to line up in a way that made me feel less alone and more capable of holding them accountable. I was not interested in vengeance. I wanted safety for Nathan, for other families, and for the tired older women who think their signatures make them invisible. The legal fight was only starting to warm up. The next days would bring motions from the defense, the naming of experts, and preparation for the big day in court when all the evidence would be set before 12 strangers and the truth would be weighed. As I walked into the prosecutor's office to review the next set of exhibits, the wall clock read 9:04 a.m. I put my hand on the file and steadied myself. The path ahead was long. There would be shouting in a courtroom. There would be arguments about interpretation. There would be the uncomfortable glare of public scrutiny. There would also be moments of relief, the feeling of being believed by investigators who took the time to follow the trail. I had been kicked out on my grandson's birth, and I would not let that night be the last word. I had a voice. I had a ledger. I had witnesses. And slowly, in meetings and subpoenas and small courtrooms, those things began to line up in a way that made me feel less alone and more capable of holding them accountable. I was not interested in vengeance. I wanted safety for Nathan, for other families, and for the tired older women who think their signatures make them invisible. The legal fight was only starting to warm up. The next days would bring motions from the defense, the naming of experts, and preparation for the big day in court when all the evidence would be set before 12 strangers and the truth would be weighed. I felt the old fear, the hollow stomach before a storm, but beneath it, a sturdier thread, resolve. I went home that evening and sat on my porch and folded the day's papers into a neat stack. The sun slipped behind the maple tree and the air tasted of cut grass. David sat with me, and we watched Nathan sleep across the street through the window. He reached over and took my hand without fanfare. "Thank you," he said simply. It was not a full apology, not yet, but it was a beginning. Tomorrow would be another meeting, another exhibit, another chance to make sure the records told the story correctly. I was ready to do it. I had been pushed out of a birth room, humiliated, and almost erased. I would not be erased. I would tell the story of what had happened that night and why it mattered. I kept my ledger close and my hands ready. The trial loomed, and with it the moment where private pain would be made public. I would stand and I would speak. For Nathan, for anyone who might be targeted next, I would make my voice count. The courthouse steps, the fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic in memory, all of these would be witnesses to what we would say in front of 12 jurors. I brushed my fingers over the stack of photocopies and taped the edges so nothing fell out. The night air chilled, and I went inside to prepare, because that is what you do when the rest of the world has shaken you. You organize, you gather evidence, you steady yourself for the fight ahead. The story was not over. It had only reached the point where the truth would be tested under oath. The courtroom smelled of paper and coffee. The morning sun cut through the high windows in bands, laying the jury box in pale rectangles. Men and women shuffled into their chairs, faces set the way faces are when they know they must decide for strangers what is true. I sat in the gallery with my stack of photocopies under my hand, the taped edges cool against my palm, and watched the room fill. Jury selection took most of the day. Prospective jurors came forward under oath, and the lawyers asked questions that felt like fishing for temperament and prejudice. Some said they had strong feelings about hospitals, about families, about men who ran motels late at night. Others said they had never been in trouble in their lives. One woman, a teacher, admitted she had a hard time believing anyone would deliberately harm a child. She was excused. Another man, a retired firefighter, met the prosecutor's look and kept his seat. When the 12 were finally sworn, a hush descended. Judge Calder took his place on the bench, small and exacting, and reminded everyone that the proceeding was not a theater. "Facts," he said, "will determine this case. You will be asked to weigh testimony and evidence, nothing more. His voice had the flat authority of someone who has seen too many lives parceled into exhibits. The prosecutor, Mara Lynn, rose first for opening statements. She did not aim for heat. She laid out a simple architecture, a plan hatched in a motel room to keep a daughter from her mother's presence at a birth, phone calls, a falsified note, signatures coerced. She named Marcus plainly, recounted the photocopies and the receipts, and promised the jury they would hear from the people who had seen pieces of the plot. "This is not about vengeance," she said quietly. "This is about the choice to silence a witness and the choice to endanger a newborn in the process. You will see records, you will hear voices. You will decide if the ledger of actions matches the ledger of truth." She folded her hands and sat down. The defense rose with a different cadence. His opening was quicker, edged. He painted a different map. A hospital in chaos, mistakes made by overworked staff, misread names, and misremembered times. He suggested that motives were complex, that anger and misunderstanding could explain signatures that later seemed suspicious. He did not deny that people had been hurt. He asked the jury to consider whether hurt alone proved guilt. "You will hear choice of words, not choices of crime," he said, and there was an attempt at warmth that failed to reach his eyes. The first witness was Agent Chen. She described the investigatory trail with the kind of calm I had seen in the prosecutor's office: timelines, subpoenas, motel registers, staff interviews. She explained how the motel witness, an assistant manager who had been on duty that night, came forward after being contacted by the agents. The manager had initially been reluctant, claiming only to remember a white sedan and a man in a navy coat. But when presented with a photograph board and questions about times, his certainty sharpened. "I'm sure I saw Marcus," Chen said. "I could place him in the parking lot between 11:30 and midnight. I could place him at the back table talking into his phone." During cross-examination, the defense tried to unsettle Chen. He asked about gaps in her notes, about interactions that could have introduced bias. Chen answered plainly, her voice steady enough to make the questions land as what they were. When she mentioned the hospital records and how timestamps aligned with phone records, the defense objected to leading testimony. Judge Calder allowed much of it, and a murmur moved through the room like a held breath. Then the motel manager took the stand. He was a man with a steady manner and hands that refused to stay still. He described a smell of cigarette smoke, the clack of high heels, the slamming of car doors. He pointed to Marcus's picture and told the jury that he had seen him speaking with someone over the phone, gesturing more than once that evening. The defense tried to show how daylight could change a memory, how fatigue made faces blend. The manager broke when the defense suggested his recollection might be mistaken. He said, "I remember his voice, sir. It had a laugh like a chain." That line earned nothing in the ledger of evidence, but it earned something in the room: human texture. Days blurred into each other then. Testimony, expert witnesses, the naming of handwriting analysts who compared signatures on forms with known exemplars. An expert from the hospital explained their logging system, the way admissions clerks stamped time in a ledger that updated across 3 terminals. He was careful not to dramatize. He explained probabilities and error rates. Still, when he held up the printout that showed the entry time matching the phone record, a hush dropped over my corner of the gallery. On the 3rd day, it was my turn. We sat in that small room behind the prosecutor's office and went over what I would say. Mara folded her fingers and asked me to tell the truth as I remembered it. "Speak plainly," she said. "If your voice shakes, let it. The jurors will understand, and the truth is in the papers." David stood to the side, his jaw tight. He tried to look casual. He cleared his throat twice and settled into a chair with the kind of restlessness that clung to him like a second skin. I had practiced the facts with Agent Chen, with the handwriting analyst, with Mara. The ledger sat next to my elbow, my list of notes, the timeline I had assembled in the weeks after the birth. It had been a friend and a weapon both. I remembered the humiliating moment of being forcibly removed from the hospital as if it had a texture. The linoleum under my feet, the curt voice at the desk, the smell of antiseptic and flowers. I remembered verifying names on forms late into the night under the lamp. I remembered finding the motel receipt in a pocket of a jacket hanging in a closet I had never thought to check. When Judge Calder swore me in, I felt the formalities anchor me. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" he asked. "I do," I said. I started with the night. I did not dramatize. I told the jurors what had happened in the hospital in the spare, exact way that evidence requires: times, places, signatures, the movement of people. I described finding the receipt, where it had been folded, the inked note on the back with a phone number. I told them how I had gone to the clerk's desk and asked for copies of the admission logs. I told them how the dates and times aligned with the line in my ledger where I had written, in my own hand, that I had been shoved away from a room where my daughter lay in labor. I was told I could not be there, I said. I was told to wait outside. I left because I had no other choice. Mara asked me about the ledger. I explained that it was not something I had invented afterward. I keep notes, I said. I write down dates when something feels important. That night felt important. She allowed me to show the original pages and compared entries to the photocopies we had supplied. The handwriting analyst later testified that the dates on my ledger predated when copies were made, that certain edges of the paper bore the light fading consistent with time. They were technical points meant to shore up the ledger's authenticity, but even the jurors who had been skeptical watched each exchange with narrowed eyes. Cross-examination was harder. The defense attorney asked about my memory, about whether anger might have blurred the facts. He implied that my desire for accountability could have stitched together disparate things into a single accusation. He suggested motives: rancor, attention, and attempt to punish. I felt the old shame rise, the one that comes with being accused of exaggeration. I answered each question slowly. "I would never have written those things down if I did not mean them," I said. "I would not have pursued this if I had not believed it mattered." He pressed me on specifics: how long it took to get copies, who else had seen the note on the receipt before I turned it over to the police, whether I had altered anything. My voice did tremble when I spoke of being pushed out. "Yes," I said, "someone lifted my arm. I remember the fabric of her sleeve being warm. I remember asking for a moment. I remember the nurse's voice. The court reporter's keys tapped beneath us like a second heartbeat. Outside the courtroom during a mid-afternoon recess, David hugged me without fanfare. He had seen the defense's attempt to paint me as emotional and unreliable, and he reached for me as if to say he believed me without demanding the explanation. Nathan slept in the stroller near the hall, a small bundle wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of milk and detergent. He was too young to know the trial, but somehow the whole thing felt oriented around keeping him safe. After I testified, the prosecution called the motel security video: grainy, time-stamped, small square frames showing a parking lot and a figure in the shadow of a sedan. It was not dramatic footage of an overt act. It was a patchwork of moments that, placed beside the motel manager's testimony and the phone records, made an argument: proximity, opportunity, pattern. The defense attempted to discredit it. The footage was low resolution, faces indistinct, the clocks on the motel's cameras potentially 5 minutes off. Mara countered by showing the synchronization between the motel camera time and the motel receipt, the same stamp that had been tucked into the jacket. When those visual pieces slid together, they formed a silhouette that felt, in the quiet of that large room, heavier than allegations. The defense never stopped trying to make reasonable doubt a crowd. He called attention to the gaps in the staff's memory, to the possibility of misfiled forms and misdirected calls. He suggested that the original decision to exclude me from the room had been the hospital's ham-fisted attempt to manage a hectic birth, not the result of a conspiracy. He was persuasive in a manner that made me grateful for Mara's deliberate clarity. By the second week, witnesses for the defense began to appear. Nurses who remembered the night in fragments, a hospital administrator who conceded that protocol could have been clearer, and a woman who testified that sometimes families asked to be separated to protect privacy during labor. Their testimony cut at the edges of the prosecution's narrative, softening some of its sharpness. It was painful to watch. The courtroom is a place where human complexity is hauled in and weighed like separate sacks of grain. Some testimonies made me ache because they were true in their own small way. Protocols are rarely neat. People do their jobs imperfectly. Still, there were moments that could not be erased. The handwriting analyst on the defense side could not explain the alignment of the receipt with the motel's point-of-sale imprint. A phone company representative called by the prosecution confirmed that the number written on the receipt had, indeed, made a short series of calls that night to a number later traced to Marcus. Small things joined into a lattice. On a late afternoon when fatigue lay over everyone like dust, an elderly woman from another case came into the gallery and sat quietly. She watched the jurors as if they were a choir being taught to sing a hard song. Later, in the corridor, she stopped me and said, "Don't let them tell you that remembering is a crime." She did not know my name. She did not need to. Inside the court, the defense kept trying to recast motive. He called character witnesses for Marcus who spoke of his kindness and generosity, of a man who had supported neighbors and volunteered his time. Mara countered by saying that kindness in some settings does not preclude malice in others. She reminded the jury that a person could sit on both sides of a line. The tension between these two pictures, one of a man capable of kindness, another of a man involved in a plan to exclude and manipulate, was the core of the jury's task. As the trial pressed on, my role shifted subtly. I was no longer simply someone who had been pushed out of a room. I had been pressed into service as a witness to a larger pattern. People came forward who had not initially spoken. A woman who worked nights at the motel and remembered a suspicious exchange. A clerk from the admissions desk who, after seeing the photocopies, said she had a faint recollection of an extra signature that matched the note we had found. Each new testimony stitched another knot into the long seam of the case. There were moments of small grace. A juror, number 7, a young man who worked in a hardware store, left a note in the court's public comment box about how he had been moved by the ledger's quiet insistence. Judge Calder would not read it aloud, but Mara told me about it in the hallway, and her face, tired as it was, softened. David brought Nathan to a hearing one morning and let me hold him for a moment before the day's proceedings began. The smell of him under the harsh courtroom lights steadied me in a way I could not have predicted. Then, as the defense finished its case, it launched its last gambit. They sought to call into question the chain of custody of the receipt and certain hospital logs. They subpoenaed an outside technician to suggest that the printer used to render copies could have produced artifacts. It was a strategy designed to sow a final hedge of doubt. Mara responded by lining up the chain: who had handled each paper, when it had been copied, where it had been stored. The jury watched as lawyers argued over technicalities that, in the end, were about trust. Whether the paper in front of them could be trusted to reflect what had happened. On the final morning before closing arguments, the courtroom felt thinner, as if the air had been filtered. Witnesses had gone home. The jurors sat like a small town in suspension. Mara asked for a moment, then rose to speak to the jury with a voice that held both fatigue and precision. She recounted the facts without ornament. "This is not a story of perfect clarity," she said. "It is a story of choices. You will decide whether the choices were isolated mistakes or whether they were part of a deliberate attempt to keep a family apart and to manipulate a hospital's trust." She walked slowly, laying each piece on the table like a seamstress aligning fabric. The defense argued that the evidence left too much room for doubt. He appealed to the jurors' caution. If the state could not prove each element beyond a reasonable doubt, they must acquit. He spoke of the cost of conviction. His last words were not harsh. They were a plea that the courts remain a knife used only when necessary. When the judge gave his instructions, he read them the way a man reads an oracle he has studied for years. The law is precise, and the sum of all these testimonies had to be measured against it. The jurors filed out to begin their deliberations, and in the hush that followed, the gallery felt like a held breath. David took my hand as we stood. His fingers were warm. He did not speak. We walked out into a late autumn street where the sun had burned through much of the morning haze. People we had not known before, neighbors, a woman from the PTA, approached us with quiet words of thanks or with the nervous, awkward kindness of those who don't know what to say. It was not the end. It was only the moment when the story moved from the open arena of testimony into the private calculation of judgment. That night, as I stacked the papers again, I allowed myself to feel both tired and strangely unburdened. I had spoken. I had offered the ledger and the receipts and my own memory. The rest would be the jury's task. Justice is slow, I reminded myself. 3 steps forward, 1 step back, but always forward. I thought of Nathan asleep in his crib, the steady rise of his chest like small tides I could not yet name. When the phone rang the next morning, my heart jumped. It was Agent Chin, her voice clipped with excitement. "They reached a note," she said. "They're close to a verdict." Close, but not there. I took a breath and let the silence after her words be a place where both fear and hope could live for a little while. The jury returned that afternoon. They filed in with the sort of precise faces jurors wear when hours of private talk have been had. The forewoman stood and said simply, "We have reached a verdict." The courtroom settled into itself like a room preparing for a storm. I rose when my name was called, hands folded at my front. The clerk read the charge, and the forewoman spoke the words the room had been tightening toward. For a long second, nothing else existed but those syllables. Then, finally, the verdict that would not erase the memory, but might change the future. Guilty on certain counts, not guilty on others. The balance tipped in the measure the jury had found, enough to make a legal finding, and not everything we'd sought. When the gavel came down, it was not a victory painted with fireworks. It felt like the closing of a long, necessary sentence. People exhaled, some quietly, some with the pitchers of emotion that have been waiting a long time to be poured out. David's hand found mine again, and this time he did not squeeze so much as anchor me. Outside, people clapped softly, strangers and friends folding their small celebrations into the fall air. The sentencing would come later. There would be motions, there would be appeals, there would be another slow nodding of justice. But in the moment after the verdict, I allowed myself the relief that had been denied me on the night my grandson was born. I was not erased. My voice had been counted. We walked out of the courthouse under a sky that had been scrubbed clean by rain the night before. Nathan slept in David's arms, and the weight of him felt like a promise I could not yet name. As we crossed the steps, a woman I didn't know reached out and touched my arm. "Thank you," she said, and in her eyes was the recognition of what it costs to stand up and tell the truth. That evening, in the quiet of my kitchen, I made tea and unfolded the photocopies once more. The edges were soft from being handled. The ledger lay open to the page where the night had been recorded. I traced the letters of my handwriting and thought of the small, stubborn acts that had led us here, asking questions, keeping notes, refusing to be invisible. The law had done its work, uneven and imperfect though it was. The rest, repair, reconciliation, the careful rebuilding of trust, would be longer and would not move at a judge's pace. But there was a new thing in the house now, a sense that words could make a difference, that signatures and receipts and ordinary documents might speak when people could not. I kept the ledger close and the photocopies in a locked drawer. There were calls to make, interviews to defer, a life to return to that would bear the subtle trace of what had happened, some nights lighter, some nights shadowed. In bed that night, I listened to the house breathe. Down the street, a child laughed, and the sound threaded through the dark like a soft promise. I closed my eyes and let the minutes pass. There would be other fights, procedural, legal, personal. There would be people who would not be satisfied by guilt on paper. There would be moments when I would return to the edges of shame and have to stand again. But for now, there was a small peace. The ledger had been read, and the jurors had listened. Nathan slept, and my grandson's breath rose and fell with the gentle certainty of new life. Outside, the maple tree shook loose a leaf that scudded across the pavement and came to rest against the curb. It seemed to me then, absurdly and truly, that justice is like that leaf. It falls, it follows the wind for a time, and finally it rests. There is no grand finality, only the steady work of picking up what remains and tending it so it might grow anew. The next morning, Agent Chen stopped by to say the arraignment would be within weeks, and that the state would recommend a sentence that matched the seriousness of the convictions. She said it without triumph. "What you did mattered," she said. "You helped other people see." I thanked her, and she left. The sun through the kitchen window made patterns on the table where my ledger lay open like an old, honest map. There would be more legal pages to turn, more hearings, and the thin procedural ceremonies of justice. There would be conversations with David about rebuilding trust with his brother, about the boundaries that had to be set for Nathan's safety. And there would be, I hoped, slow mending, measured, patient work of repair that could not be legislated but only lived. For the first time in a long while, I believed that the small, deliberate knots I had taught myself to tie could hold. As I closed the ledger that afternoon, I heard Nathan's soft cry from the room across the hall. My footsteps were careful as I went to him, and when he looked up at me with eyes that had not yet learned fear, I felt something uncoil inside me, an old, resolute tenderness. I picked him up, breathed him in, and let the quiet of the house settle around us like a promise that, for now, the last word would not be humiliation. It would be the slow, steady work of keeping him safe. Outside, the maple tree shed another leaf. I watched it spin in the wind and thought, briefly, of the jury and the long stitches they had helped make. The repair would continue. I would keep my ledger and my voice, and I would keep showing up at the small and necessary places where truth meets consequence. The rest of the world could wait while I learned how to live in the aftermath, careful and intentional, with hands that had learned how to steady a trembling pen.